Well, I escorted my children who are now in the 10th, 6th, and 5th grade with great happiness that they are going back to school and great hope that they will have a regular, normal year with a few as possible out of school due to quarantine, isolation, or sickness. There is concern, but we know that children are not the main source of infections, and the schools are not the main source. And even if we are going to see infections in schools, we should better protect the vulnerable population, which is the elderly and not the children.
It seems like epidemiologists, and you among them, are treating COVID-19 at this point not like we did last year. Of course, we've learned much. Treating it perhaps like a flu that's going to be prevalent in schools. We are going to see pockets of it, but you don't expect that schools will be closed, that whole classrooms or grades will be sent for isolation this year?
I would say a bit the opposite in the sense that we are not treating it like the flu. You know that according to the pandemic preparedness plan, in flu pandemic, you need to close schools because we know that in influenza, the children are a main vector of transmission, but not for COVID-19. In COVID-19, they could be a vector of transmission, but they get much less sick. So I don't think we should treat it like flu. We should treat it like COVID-19 pandemic in a country that is highly vaccinated, now with a third dose. And we know what we need to do is to protect the vulnerable population by vaccination, by preventing mass crowding, which is not done enough in Israel. Today in Israel, you can hold a wedding with 400 people indoors, which is high risk, and we call the Israeli Public Health Physician Association to stop this. But children are not allowed, or what some people call not allowed to go to school, when we know the hazardous implications of closing the schools on obesity, on loneliness. So I'm very glad that the Israeli government listened to public health professionals and opened the schools. I am concerned. I do not know what will happen this month. I'm concerned about Rosh Hashanah, what will happen when in mass gatherings, in synagogues and at homes. And I know that, in August, hundreds of Israelis died from COVID-19. I'm afraid that this also will happen in September, but not because of the schools and the kindergartens, but because of the virus. And we need to find the right balance between living with COVID-19, but living and not dying, and living by having some limitations, but allowing the kids to grow up and to be educated.
You mentioned the high holidays that are coming up. In just a few days, it will be Rosh Hashanah and then Yom Kippur, etc. More than 10,000 people will be allowed to participate in prayers at the Western Wall. This is what the Western Wall has published, the organization that manages it. And we see also Hasidics going away to Uman, for example, in order to pray. We also see, on the other hand, concerts, of course, with thousands of people attending concerts indoors. How do you explain the gap in the regulations, having known everything that you just mentioned about the way that kids get sick and transmit it versus the way that adults get sick and transmit COVID?
Well, I hope that the prayers at the Western Wall will be answered. But of course, praying could not be the only policy. I think that we should distinguish between outdoors and indoors. We know that the risk outdoors is much lower. And we know that the risk also depends on the activity. If you wear a mask, if you speak loud, you increase the risk of transmission. If you hug someone else or drink or eat together, you increase the risk. That's why I'm so worried about weddings in closed spaces. I am less worried about mass gathering outside, even at the Western Wall, but it also depends. I do expect in such a gathering to keep some distance between the people, to avoid shouting. If that's not the situation, we increase the risk, and that's a shame. And I'm worried that sometimes commercial interests, such as the performance that you mentioned, overcome health aspects, and we should take better care of that. Yes, I think that the mass gatherings, especially indoors, are risky for Israel and for other countries. And living with Corona does not mean that you can do whatever you did 2 years ago before COVID-19 times.
Professor Hagai Levine from Hadassah, thank you very much for joining us.